World powers reach a controversial deal with Iran over its nuclear program. What does it mean for the Middle East and beyond? Hello, I'm Nathan King, sitting in for Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. In a historic agreement, negotiators from Iran, the United States and 5 other world powers announced a landmark deal to curb Iran's nuclear program. The sometimes testy negotiations culminated in an agreement that was praised by some and condemned by others, including Saudi Arabia and Israel. Later, we'll talk with Iran's former ambassador to Germany and a former US negotiator with Iran. But first, we get the latest on the agreement from CCTV's Richard Bestick in Vienna. Richard, let us know what the key provisions are in this agreement, will you?
Well, the core bargain here, Nathan, is very much related to reining in Iran's nuclear program in return for lifting these sanctions that have crippled the Iranian economy over the last 12 years. The broad outline of what they were discussing here over the last 18 days was agreed in Lausanne in the draft agreement there. Specifically, what the agreement, and there's 100 pages of it, what the agreement will do is it will slash the number of centrifuges by 2/3. It'll reduce stockpiles of enriched uranium by 98%. It'll allow nuclear-related search for peaceful purposes only. And the agreement will lift economic sanctions only once the International Atomic Energy Agency confirms compliance. It will restore sanctions if the deal is violated and maintain a UN embargo on conventional weapons for 5 years and on ballistic missiles for 8 years. Now, it was that last point very much, Nathan, that held these talks up, that ended in threats to walk out and cause a number of rows around the table. They have come now to that agreement. It is a compromise accepted on both sides. There's been a lot of talk of history in the making here in Vienna, Nathan. I think this is probably one of those occasions when you can really use that phrase and mean it.
When this is all said and done, Richard, what were the atmospherics between the key negotiators? Because they've been at it for such a long time, haven't they?
The chemistry between the various players was extraordinary. It was an extraordinary 18 days all round, Nathan. I mean, just to get that level of diplomatic muscle in one town all at the same time to force through this single issue of foreign policy, Iran's nuclear program, was extraordinary in itself. All big people, and all of them with a personality larger than life. And I think the chemistry around the table, really the most interesting one probably was that relationship between Zarif and Kerry. They had something like 23 face-to-face meetings. Some of them got really feisty. On one occasion, an official had to go in and tell the two diplomats to keep their voices down because they could be heard all over the table. But that was the level of passion, and that was the level of commitment that they threw into these negotiations. Others around the table, prickly relationships. Kerry and Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, for example, very difficult there because the two have obviously got this other thing going in the Ukraine and sanctions being imposed on Russia.
History in the making in Vienna. Thanks, Richard. That's CCTV's Richard Bestick reporting there. Thanks. Joining us from Vienna is Mohammad Marandi. He's the Dean of the Faculty of World Studies at the University of Tehran. Mohammad Marandi, thanks so much for joining us. First of all, I have to ask you, what's your reaction to this historic deal?
Well, as you point out, it is a very important deal because for the first time, really, the United States has been forced to accept the Iranian peaceful nuclear program. I think that is the most significant thing to come out of this altogether. All sides gave concessions, there was flexibility, but at the end of the day, if there's one thing that we have to keep in mind, that is that despite the United States forcing the UN Security Council in previous years to impose sanctions on the country. And despite the fact that the United States applied punitive sanctions itself and threatened other countries with sanctions if they did business with Iran, despite all that, ultimately the United States had to accept Iran's peaceful nuclear program. And we have to remember that in the past, the United States was saying that Iran does not have the right to enrich uranium. So I think all in all, it's a good deal for Iran, and it's not a bad deal for the United States necessarily if they really were to rethink their policy towards our part of the world and towards Iran. If the United States changes its behavior towards the country, it would benefit a great deal. But we have to also keep in mind that the United States is still imposing a large number of sanctions against the country. U.S. policy in the region is in conflict with that of Iran because of U.S. support for Saudi Arabia and Turkey in their support for Al-Qaeda. So Iranian-U.S. relations are pretty poor, and I don't think they will change very quickly, though.
And it's clear that the United States still doesn't trust Iran. I want to play you one of the pieces of sound from U.S. President Barack Obama announcing this deal.
Because of this deal, Iran will not produce the highly enriched uranium and weapons-grade plutonium that form the raw materials necessary for a nuclear bomb. Because of this deal, Iran will remove 2/3 of its installed centrifuges, the machines necessary to produce highly enriched uranium for a bomb, and store them under constant international supervision. Because of this deal, we will, for the first time, be in a position to verify all of these commitments. That means this deal is not built on trust. It is built on verification.
Mohammad Marandi, that does not sound like a man who is basically allowing a peaceful nuclear program to go forward. And the agreement, if you read it, is pretty strict. 98% of uranium that's been enriched has to be put on one side. Inspections of military facilities as well as civilian nuclear. Sanctions phased out. The arms embargo still there. Limits on missile production. I could go on. This seems like a very tough deal for Tehran.
Well, I think that's how the Americans are spinning it out. It's not exactly an accurate assessment. First of all, there will be no inspections of Iranian military sites, and that when people read the text of the deal, it's quite clear. Any access to any area will be very clearly defined, and there will be no inspections where Americans or the IAEA is allowed to go into military sites and look around. They will be using technology. They'll be able to do soil samples. The Iranians have no problem for the IAEA trying to detect whether there's radiation or not, but the Iranians will not allow any UN inspectors or IAEA inspectors into sensitive defense sites. On the other hand, the IR-1 centrifuges that the Iranians use are not, they're very low quality. They are the first types of centrifuges that the country developed, and they are expensive and they're not quite good. What the Iranians, what they are basically doing is they've given away some of these centrifuges, but on the other hand, the Iranians will continue with research and development, and they're working on IR-6 and IR-8, which are both much more developed centrifuges. So after a number of years, when the deal between Iran and the P5+1 come to an end, Iran will have carried out its research and development on more advanced centrifuges, and it will be able to deploy them in order to enrich uranium. With regards to highly enriched uranium, Iran never developed highly enriched uranium for military purposes. I think your viewers would remember that Iran only produced enriched uranium at 20% because the Americans tried to prevent Iran from importing nuclear fuel at 20%, which the Iranians needed and need for the Tehran reactor, which produces medical isotopes for cancer patients. The Americans were taking Iranian patients hostage to put pressure on Iran, and Iran was forced, therefore, to enrich uranium at higher percentages and produce that fuel. So if the Americans are willing to behave more appropriately towards Iran and allow Iran to obtain the materials it needs from abroad, the Iranians won't have the need to enrich uranium at such high percentages.
Mohammad Marandi, what about the sanctions? Because they are going to be phased out by the UN Security Council, the US and the European Union. What will that now mean for Iran and its people?
Well, both sides are going to move forward phase by phase and step by step. And so some of the sanctions will be removed after the UN Security Council resolution is passed, those that have to do with the banking sector, those that have to do with trade and business. So, and then other elements will be removed later on. So it's, you know, the Iranians will carry out certain commitments, and the Americans and the P5+1 will also carry out their commitments. When both sides, if both sides are satisfied, then they'll move on to the next stage. I think it will have an impact on the Iranian economy relatively soon, but I don't think the impact will be, you know, very great or very sudden. I think those who visited Iran know that usually what we hear from, you know, the Western media is an exaggerated or a caricature of the situation inside Iran. In Iran, the economy does continue to grow, though at a slower pace than before, and the sanctions have had a significant impact. But it is not as if you know, people are looking for food on the streets.
I want to ask you about whether this deal can go forward and be implemented. There are a lot of people in the region who are very skeptical of this, including Israel, who even before the details were fully published, we had Benjamin Netanyahu come out and said this is a historic mistake of a deal. Saudi Arabia has big problems with the deal as well. What would you say to the rest of the region?
Well, Israel, you know, from an Iranian perspective, it is upset because of the fact that the deal lessens tension in the region. And the Israeli regime thrives on having an unstable region. From an Iranian perspective, it's an apartheid state, and the only way that it can draw attention away from itself is to create or help create crises in neighboring countries, and to draw attention away and to draw attention towards Iran. You know, the fact that Iran has been able to retain its peaceful nuclear program shows Iran's inherent strength as an independent country, and I think it also vindicates the fact that Iran continued to pursue its peaceful nuclear program over the past few years. This has given Iran the capability to have a strong hand at the negotiating table.
One last question. There are two visions of what happens next with Iran in the international community. Some say this will help the US and Iran forge a new relationship of cooperation in the greater Middle East, whether it comes to Iraq or elsewhere. Others say the financial bonanza that Iran will get after these sanctions means they will be more able to help groups like Hezbollah and prop up the Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. What do you think the consequences regionally are going to be of this deal, medium and long term?
Well, I think the international community never has had a problem with Iran. The problem really is a handful of Western countries. Right now, these Western countries should be very grateful to Hezbollah and to the Syrian government for preventing ISIL and Al-Qaeda or Al-Qaeda, the Nusra Front, among other groups, from taking over the whole of Syria. And if Syria, of course, had fallen, they would have been able to take over Iraq as well, and as well as Lebanon. So if it wasn't actually for the Syrian government's perseverance, and if it wasn't for Hezbollah, the catastrophe that has been brought about in this region, thanks to U.S. policy, thanks to the Turkish president, and thanks to Saudi Arabia and other Wahhabi regimes that export this extremism, if it wasn't for these groups, the security of Europe would have been much more deeply threatened today. So despite the fact that they antagonize Iran and the governments like the Iraqi government or the Syrian government that the Iranians have been supporting, they know quite well that if it wasn't for Iran, the situation would have been much worse today.
Mohammad Marandi in Vienna, where that historic deal was inked over many, many days. Thank you so much. We need to